good friend of ours, as well as a neurologist and a doctor here in Yerushalayim. And rather than make long-winded introductions, which I'll leave to him possibly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Moshe Dickman.
Thank you very much, and good luck. I was just thinking on the way over here how about 15 or 20 years ago, when I was doing my residency at Kings County Hospital, those of you who are from the New York area probably know Kings County Hospital, I made two big assumptions at that time. I dealt with a large population of Hispanics, and major problem I was confronted with was the neurological complications of alcoholism, as well as other agents. Cocaine and heroin were not that popular at that time. Subsequently found to be wrong. The first was that these problems were confined to this population, this socioeconomic population. Second of all, I assumed that there was nothing you could do about it. Our guest speaker tonight, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, has shown through a lot of hard work over the past years that these problems of drug abuse, alcoholism, heroin, cocaine addiction, these are problems that are epidemic, assuming epidemic proportions at the present time, and not only confined to the black and Hispanic populations, but unfortunately are affecting the Jewish community as well. But on the positive side, there is something very definitely that can be done about it. Now, in a little town called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I don't know whether any of you have heard of Pittsburgh, and those of you who have heard of it, I don't know how many of you have ever bothered stopping there. But there's an awful lot happening in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm not going to say too much more about it, because I'm sure you will hear about it very shortly. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Abraham Twersky, is a noted psychiatrist, to be sure, lecturer, an author, and a friend. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Twersky.
Merit some tension, even b'sochefe Yerushalayim. How big our problem is, I don't know that we have any way of knowing. How can you tell? Can you hear back there? If you don't, yeah. Okay. Extremely difficult to tell about the true incidence of a problem whose hallmark is denial. Denial and cover-up. So that the alcoholic denies that he has a problem, and by the very fact that I said the word the alcoholic denies that he has a problem, indicates one of the problems that we have. Because we always talk about the alcoholic as being a he. As though women don't have the problem. And in fact, it wasn't until about 20 years ago that we looked around and we say, hey, look, we have no literature on alcoholism in women. Because everybody has assumed that alcoholism only exists in males. It's just in the last 20 years that the literature on alcoholism in the United States has begun to deal with the woman alcoholic. Now, if you think there's been a problem in overcoming the denial about alcoholism in men, imagine what it's like overcoming the horrendous stigma of admitting that my wife is an alcoholic, my sister's an alcoholic, my daughter's an alcoholic. What kind of stigma is that in the family? And if you think the problem is in the population as a whole, what's it going to be like among the Jewish population? And one doesn't even reveal that one has diabetes, let alone alcoholism. And, of course, there's all kinds of rationalizations or valid reasons why this is so. If in the general population, a young man and young woman meet, and they fall in love, and he subsequently becomes aware that her brother was a drug addict, or is a drug addict. Well, that's one of the breaks. One of the top things in life, but they already have a relationship going. Well, that's not so in those circles where boy does not meet girl, but the relationship begins with a shidduch, where there's very often some careful research done on both sides of the family. And then it should it turn out that there's any kind of problem, the shidduch may never even begin. And that may very well apply to physical diseases, let alone problems of such enormous stigma as alcoholism or drug addiction. So as you can understand, a few weeks ago I received a call from a woman in New York who began saying, "I hope you won't mind, but I cannot tell you my name." I said, "I don't mind, but it wouldn't make a difference if you did tell me, because I don't know any people in New York." She says, "Well, we are a very prominent Jewish family. And last year my husband had a business reversal. I don't know exactly how it happened, but somebody wanted to help him because he was very depressed and gave him a little cocaine. And after several uses of it, he became hooked on cocaine. And she says, things are now in a horrible shape." I said, "Does he want help?" She says, "Well, it's bad enough that he realizes that he needs help, and he will go for help." I said, "Well, I don't see any problem. I'll be glad to see him if he wants to come out to Pittsburgh." She said, "Well, I understand that there were other New Yorkers who come to Pittsburgh to your institution." I said, "Yes, that's true." She said, "We can't risk anybody, he'll easily be recognized, and we can't risk his being identified, exposed." I said, "Look, if you think you're going to be able to conceal this much longer, you're making a mistake. There's no way to successfully conceal problems such as alcoholism or drug addiction." She says, "You don't understand. Our children are of the age where we're going to do shidduchim, and if it ever gets around, any suspicion that my husband has a problem with drugs, it's all over for our children." And I can understand where she's coming from. I said, "Look, you don't have to come to Pittsburgh. There are 6,000 institutes for treatment of drug addiction in the United States, and I'll be glad to give you a few names. I can give you one in Minnesota, I can give you one in Idaho, but don't be surprised if you go to any one of those that you find your neighbor down the street who's going there for the same reason." But we are dealing with a serious problem where the cover-up is immense. You see, stigma is bad enough, but there's something worse than a stigma, and that's a shanda. You just can't compare a stigma to a shanda. They're not quantitatively different. They're qualitatively different. A shanda is a shanda. It's a totally different concept. Now, I don't know what the incidence, as I mentioned, when there's such intense cover-up, who can say what the incidence is? In Pittsburgh, I'm not sure on what basis anybody made that study or made those findings, but someone said that in the Jewish community of Pittsburgh, between the ages of 15 and 25, 35% of Jewish youth are hooked. Now, That's a phenomenal number. And if they're off by 100%, so it's 17%. So it's 10%, so it's 5%. I know we're talking about horrendous numbers. And again, I have no way of knowing. Are they on the mark? Are they way off? What's even of greater concern is that these kinds of problems have shown a pattern of epidemic spread. And it can break through all barriers. One would think that people who have a great many restrictions on their behavior and that this is so out of keeping for them to use drugs or to use alcohol. You know, alcohol is also a problem. The idea that shikar is a goy has fallen by the wayside. Maybe that was true years ago. I wasn't around 100 years ago. But today, unfortunately, the excessive and pathological use of alcohol is quite prominent, at least among American Jews. The best indication of that is not statistical studies, but the best indication of that, at least in the United States, was that 20 years ago, you could not get any of the country clubs to accept a bar mitzvah or a Jewish wedding because they make their money on the drink, not on the food. Today, they are clamoring for Jewish business. So it's very clear that something has happened. Exactly what it is, I don't know, but something has happened in the consumption of alcohol. There's another aspect of addiction that we should not forget, and that is the addiction to legitimate drugs, which is every bit as serious as the addiction to illicit drugs. I could make my living by not taking in any alcoholics or any street addicts, but simply dealing with people who became addicted to drugs that were given with good intentions by a well-meaning physician, who had a patient before him who was complaining, but I can't sleep at night. I can't live without sleep. Now, strangely enough, nobody's ever died from insomnia, but people feel that they're going to die if they don't sleep. And the doctor, in good conscience, gives them a prescription for a sedative. Well, the same thing, I've got this bad backache and it's just killing me. Well, backaches can be very painful, and I can testify to that. But I've had one for the past 22 years and I'm still very much alive. So yes, they're painful, but they do not kill. But again, if you're a physician and you want to help the patient and he says, can't you do anything for my back pain? Well, supposing that it's one of those nagging back pains that is not remediable that easily, and the patient wants relief. And aspirins aren't doing it. So you give them some Percocets. Now, Percocets or Percodan or Darvon or Darvocets, or whatever the equivalents are here, are mild, if you wish, depending on the dose, narcotics, and people become addicted to them. And yes, they'll take them 1-3 times a day, just like the doctor said. But the body has a way of building up immunity to them. So after a period of time, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, the medication no longer works and the pain is right back. The person has to take 4 Perconans a day, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we get them in for addiction when they're anywhere up between 20 to 60 a day. And the same thing is true of medication that are taken for anxiety attacks. Or you want to expect me to go through life with my anxiety attacks? Is there anything you can do for me? And the well-intending physician, psychiatrist, whatever, will give them some Valium. Now, who in the world does not take Valium? It's almost abnormal not to take Valium. And the principle that I've always talked about with physicians is all of these drugs are potentially addictive. And if you do not have a cutoff period, when you can tell the patient when to stop, then you better not start. Now, if it's some sort of condition that you think that the patient may need Valium for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and you have good reason to believe that after 3 weeks they won't need it anymore, I don't have any problem. In fact, I don't have any problem if you want to give them morphine for 3 weeks. As long as you've got a cutoff point and you know when you're going to stop. The problem is that so many of these conditions are open-ended. Insomnia, anxiety, pain. When's it going to stop? And if you give a potentially addictive medication, which you have no idea when the symptoms are going to end, you're essentially inviting addiction. And it's an invitation that's accepted, because addiction, when you invite it, it counts. And obviously, people don't think that they're becoming addicted. They're getting it by prescription. Sometimes the doctor begins to be a little hesitant, and he says, now look, I've given you all the Percocets I think we should have. Now, I've been giving you 30 a week, and that's about 4, a little more, 4 plus some a day, and that's all you should have. And I don't want to give you any more. Well, there's more than one doctor in town. Right? So you go to 4 or 5 or 6 doctors, and you get a prescription from each, and you continue taking very addictive medication. And obviously, that there's no reason why that should not occur in anybody, in anyone of any caliber, right? Regardless of what one's religious practice or identification is. And there's really no practical difference between being addicted to Percodan or being addicted to heroin. The same narcotic in a slightly different form. The only thing is that the heroin addict has to go out and rob and burglarize and steal TVs and stereos and whatever else. And the Percodan addict does not, as long as he can get it legitimately from the physician. But then it gets to the point where the only thing is that the heroin addict has to go out and rob and burglarize and steal TVs and stereos and whatever else. And the Percodan addict does not, as long as he can get it legitimately from the physician. But then it gets to the point where, when you're up to 30 or 40 or 50 perks a day, that you can't function anymore. And it doesn't even relieve the pain anymore, but you can't function, and you lose control of your life, of your livelihood, family relations, or whatever. Then you begin to try, well, you see something's wrong, I better begin to cut back. And then when you begin to cut back, you get horrendous withdrawal symptoms. You can't cut back, and so you have to go into treatment. When you go into treatment, you have to admit that you're an addict, and who's going to want to admit that they're an addict? And who's going to want to be associated with alcoholics and heroin addicts, who are seen as considered to be the dregs of humanity? So we're dealing with a serious social problem, and one, as I mentioned, I cannot tell you the incidents because there's the enormous cover-up, and no one knows. I don't know that anyone can know. Israel so far, to a great extent, has been spared from the malachamovas of cocaine. That's probably coming to an end, because at least from what I heard, cocaine has begun to make an entrance here. Now, everybody's concerned about heroin, and legitimately so. Incidentally, the cocaine generally that is talked about in Israel, it's called Turkish cocaine, and it's really heroin. The cocaine is as yet not that popular, except among some of the social elite. And that's how it begins. But then it rapidly makes its descent, and it's extremely profitable to deal with cocaine. And there's no way that you can control the market. The United States has a $50 billion industry that's admitted. $50 billion in cocaine. Now, every once in a while, the Coast Guard intercepted a shipment, and they got a shipment of 100 kilograms of cocaine. And 100 kilograms of cocaine has a value of about, street value of, $5 million. So it's a tremendous thing. What they lose sight of is that the guy paid for those 100 kilograms of cocaine probably $4,000 or $5,000. Right? And he's perfectly willing to let you confiscate $4,000 or $5,000 worth of cocaine, because if only one shipment gets through, right, he can afford you confiscating the next 200. So the profit is so enormous, where you pay a few dollars per kilogram and then sell it for $80 a gram. There's 1,000 grams in each kilogram. The profit is so enormous that the law enforcement is a total failure. That's not the way to go. And it began in the same fashion in the United States, first as a very cheap thing for the elite population, the social elite, and then it made its way down and is now devastating the United States. I tell people that what's infinitely worse is that some people who should have known better made statements such as, well, cocaine is not as addictive as heroin. It's only psychologically addictive. And so people had a false sense of security that somehow it isn't as bad. What I tell people is, look, if God forbid you find out that your child is on drugs, pray hard that it's heroin. Because cocaine is worse. Cocaine is a much more dangerous addiction, a much more severe addiction, a much more devastating addiction. It is every bit as bad as heroin, and infinitely worse. And there's some very fine people using cocaine. Very fine people addicted to it. Businessmen, people who we would never think of as addicts. And it's crossed the barriers, at least in the United States, even into some of the frum population. And there are people who are from very fine families and somehow or other got involved with it. And absolutely devastating. So, if we take chemicals, in fact, that's how we talk about it now in the States. We don't even talk about alcohol or drugs or opiates or heroin. We talk about chemicals. Mind-altering chemicals. We put them all in one bag. Mind-altering chemicals are the problem. And we have to take a whole look at our practice and our attitude toward mind-altering chemicals, and that will include mashke as well. That will include the traditional l'chaim. There's nothing wrong with the traditional l'chaim. There is something wrong when you become dependent on the l'chaim. So that if a person comes home from work and says, oh, what a day at the office, I've got to have something to unwind, right? And pours himself a drink because he cannot tolerate the tension, that's the kind of problem that's apt to get us into hot water. I have no problem with a person stopping off at shul in the morning, even though he's yet before breakfast and after davening taking a l'chaim. Because for most of those people, if there's a l'chaim around, fine. If there's no schnapps around, then it's not. No. But the question is of people who use alcohol in order to function, whether it's to get rid of tension or to sleep or for whatever other reason. They use alcohol in any way that they become dependent on it. That is the beginning of a problem. And that problem exists then once the dependency begins, even though it may not become disruptive for 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 years. The problem begins in a very surreptitious fashion. Now, we've got our treatments for alcoholism and drug addiction, and they, in many instances, are quite effective. They're ideally effective when you get everyone involved to participate, which means that if you have a person who has an alcohol problem, let's assume traditionally that it's going to be the husband, or the drug problem or whatever, we want the whole family involved in treatment. Because everybody is part of the act in one way or another. Sometimes it's the permissiveness and the cover-up of the family that allows the condition to continue. So the family too has to become involved. But I'm not sure that we ought to talk so much about the treatment of alcoholism. Perhaps we ought to talk about how to prevent it. We're certainly spending a great deal of money on defense. and legitimately so. We're threatened by hostile neighbors from all around. A great deal of the problem of the Vietnam War was that the troops were demoralized by heroin. And the communists knew what to do. They got them hooked on heroin, and the heroin in Vietnam was 95% pure, in contrast to the heroin on the streets, either here or in New York, that's anywhere between 5 and 15%. And then they gave them the 95% pure stuff, and they demoralized the troops. Well, if chas v'shalom, our youth becomes demoralized by heroin and cocaine, then the Palestinians will not have to fire off one bullet. And we will self-destruct. So our problem, our immediate problem, is how to prevent such a disaster. How do we prevent the disaster in our own families? Because one of the things that we've done is we're all vulnerable. There is no such thing as being secure. That because my child is in a yeshiva, this is not going to happen. Yes, it is less likely to happen in a yeshiva environment than in a totally free environment. But it's not impossible. I know that. I can speak for the American yeshivas, where I know the problem has already crept in. Granted, it's in very, very small numbers, but as I say, I'm afraid of the epidemic effect. As to whether it's happened here, I can't tell you, but I suspect that the Talmud says, "Sadna da'avet chadu." The basis of the universe, of the earth, is all one. What happens in one part of the earth have to happen to another. The question is, what can we do to prevent? One of the first things I do is I tell parents to set an example. Don't use mind-altering drugs in a destructive fashion. Don't drink destructively. What I mean, don't drink destructively, don't drink in order to get relief from tension. You make kiddush Friday night, that's fine. You take a l'chaim after the fish, that's fine also. Right? Don't drink in order to relax, don't drink in order to sleep. Because if you do so, you're sending your kids a message. I like parents to go through their medicine chest and find out what medications are there. If there's antibiotics there, that's fine. If there's tranquilizers, incidentally, tranquilizers have an interesting history. The pharmaceutical industry constantly improves them. And every time they improve them, they make them worse. So when Librium came out, that had its problems, then they improved that and they came up with Valium, which is, from the standpoint of addiction, much more difficult. Then they came out with Ativan, which is supposed to be an improvement over Valium, and that is, from the point of addiction, much worse than Valium. And now the latest darling of the psychiatric profession is Xanax, because that's supposed to be a tranquilizer with an antidepressant effect. And if it's used in treatment of depression for 3 or 4 weeks until the antidepressant that's given up as the primary treatment takes effect, I've got no problem with it. But if people are allowed to get hooked on Xanax, which can happen quite easily, and they begin to take it regularly and continue it over a period of several years, especially if they increase the dosage, they get very much addicted to it. And should they have to get off of it, they gotta anticipate a great deal of misery. As you see, the severe effects of cocaine and heroin are over within a matter of several weeks. The severe withdrawal effects of a drug like Ativan or Xanax can be for 12 to 18 months or more. Yes?
So, most of these that did explain where the beginnings of the addiction arise for the prescription drugs.
Where the beginning of addiction?
Yeah, you explained where it rises from prescription drugs and a little bit from alcohol.
Well,
but why a drug like cocaine and heroin? Why the?
Well, let's first go with the. You said the prescription drugs first.
Well, you already explained.
The prescription drugs is okay,
With the other drugs.
and the alcohol is okay. All right. There's, for example, let's take the commercial world. Okay? There's a lot of very respectable and firm people working in executive offices, financial offices, Wall Street, etc. Right? Wall Street, the dealing in cocaine is not undercover. It's open. From the office, you send somebody out to pick up some cocaine. Right? It's very open, right? And if you're in a group where people are sniffing, and incidentally, sometimes you wonder, does a culture have a problem? You can find out from the language. I just found out last week that there's a Hebrew word, lahasnif. Lahasnif. So obviously, if the word was invented, there was a need for it. So in a situation such as that, people are standing around and like everybody's snorting and somebody says, here, give this a try. Right? And you try it once and from what they say, it has a fantastic euphoric experience. Now, I can't testify personally, I'm not about to experiment. But from what I told, it's out of this world. They've come along with something now which is even worse, and that is a type of prepared cocaine in the form of crack, where there's almost instant addiction from the first use. So that with the regular cocaine, if somebody uses it once, he may be able to put it down and not use it a second time and recognize, hey, this is too dangerous. Yeah, it was a great experience, but it's too dangerous. But then if he is whatever, and it catches him a moment of depression, and how many of us are not depressed at some time? And it catches us a weak moment, and it gives us a wonderful feeling of euphoria, of superpower. You know, under the effects of cocaine, you can do anything. You can fly without getting on an airplane. You know, it gives you unbelievable feelings of grandiosity. And the person goes back for it the second time, or third time, or fourth time. We have within, yes, well, how does it happen? So that's how it would happen in people who are out in the business world. You know, the yeshiva population is not a homogeneous one. In every yeshiva, and I remember and when I was in yeshiva, there were some guys there who were misfits. I'm not sure what they were doing there, but they were there. And sometimes you had some fellows who were known to be sort of misfits in the yeshiva, and you could probably identify them because they bounced around from yeshiva to yeshiva to yeshiva, never staying in any place more than 2 months, because somehow or other they managed to get themselves kicked out. And this is the type of guy who's apt to tell his buddy in the dormitory to try a reefer, try some marijuana, try a little hashish. And again, he's certainly not going to get 100% of the people to accept, but you know, he might find himself, so why not give it a try? Good deal. So that's the way it can get started. Oh, what I'm talking about, I must tell you something. I'm talking about prevention. Remember that, I was about to say that if the parents are taking Valium, they're sending a message to their child. And so I tell parents, go through your medicine chest and see what's there. Get rid of all medicines that are not there for illness. You ever think of it? Why take Valium if you're not sick? It's a medication. If you have insomnia, does that mean that you're sick? If you have uneasiness and tension, does that mean that you're sick? You know what the business world does, especially the pharmaceutical industry. There's one advertisement that I heard in Pittsburgh radio. Do you come home from work feeling a bit tense? Then you should take Quiet World. Well, of course I come home feeling a bit tense. I come home feeling a lot tense. I mean, there's only a limited number of jobs in the mattress testing business. And if you have any other job other than being a mattress tester, right, you're going to come home from work being tense, right? And it makes no difference whether you're a stockbroker, an accountant, a teacher, or whatever. You've got tension in your daily work. Sure, by the time you get through with work, you're going to be tense. And the message should be, find a way to relax. There are ways to relax, right? But the message is, take a chemical to knock your brain out so that you don't feel tension. That's the message of addiction, right? And if we are doing it with Valium or Xanax or Ativan or alcohol, what are we really telling our kids? It's okay to change the way you feel by using the appendix. Yes?
There are other ways.
Yeah, there are certainly many other ways to it. I shall get to that in a moment. And now I got to tell you something which I hope won't offend you. But what message are we trying to say? We're saying, yes, I know this is going to make you feel better, but because it has dangerous effects, don't use it. That's really what we're trying to prevent with addiction.